So there was an article that just came up in the New York Times. Let's see if we can find this so I don't misquote it. New York Times, masks didn't work. So, yeah, you know, when we've lost the New York Times on a particular topic that was very one-sided, we'll just say, throughout the COVID debate, you know things are changing, right? So in the opinion section of the New York Times, which is kind of like the bastion of most liberal and democratic ideas, which is fine as long as you know what you're reading, there was a piece that came out, the mask mandates did nothing. Will any lessons be learned? And we'll link to this article because I think it's a pretty interesting article. It's not behind their paywall, which is nice, of the New York Times. That, you know, basically, I read it the other night, basically said like, hey, the masks were somewhere between net neutral, net negative, and net positive. Really not enough information to see if it did anything to stop transmission or, you know, it's great. If you wanted to do that to signal socially that you cared about other people, that's fine. But it really didn't do anything. The problem is I'm willing to give, let's see, COVID kind of made its landfall in the U.S. probably November or December of 2019. It was in the public zeitgeist by like January of 2020, and by March of 2020, it was a mess, and we knew we had a real problem, right? Until March of 2020, if you remember, Trump was telling everybody to go out. Nancy Pelosi was telling people to go to like Chinese New Year celebrations in mass. Like nobody got it right. And then March, the shit hit the fan, and I would say anything that any politician, business, individual, government did up until somewhere around late summer of 2020, like you get a pass, right? Nobody knew anything. This thing could have had a 10% mortality rate instead of a, 0.1% mortality rate. And the world would be in a whole lot of hurt right now, right? Thankfully, the disease was not as vicious as it could have been. But by about the summer of 2020, we started to know some things about the disease, right? We knew that it was airborne, but it wouldn't live on surfaces, right? So all those people that were Lysoling down their grocery deliveries, they could go back to just eating their groceries. And we knew it didn't live on surfaces. And we knew, thankfully, that it didn't really harm children. And we knew that, stuff was starting to come out of like, okay, if you were old with pre-existing diabetes, heart condition, lung condition, bad metabolic health, you were morbidly obese, you were in real trouble. But pretty much by the end of 2020, we kind of knew who was at risk and who wasn't, right? And then definitely by Christmas of 2020, or at the very least, the beginning of 2021, stuff that wasn't being released by the government, that was just kind of common sense. A lot of doctors that were being censored, unfortunately, on YouTube, were basically saying, hey, man, the masks don't really work. This doesn't really work. We kind of need to let this just rip through the populace and get normal herd immunity as we would. When we come up with a vaccine, it'll be kind of like the cold or flu vaccine where this thing will mutate. Like a lot of really good information, like, hey, masks probably aren't doing anything, was known over 2 years ago in early 2021. And I remember having like these just venomous debates with people where most of my libertarian friends were like, hey man, look at the data, look at the stuff that's coming out from the scientists and, Harvard trained virologists that are being censored. One, why are they being censored? Why can't we have this conversation? This chart kind of looks a little off. It's, first they were cherry picking number of deaths, and then they were cherry picking number of cases, and then they were cherry picking like whatever stat looked the scariest. That's what the media was going with, right? Because if it bleeds, it leads. The media loved Trump and the media loved COVID because it allowed them to boost their ratings. Prior to Trump and prior to COVID, CNN was on the verge of bankruptcy. The New York Times was on the verge of bankruptcy. Like readership and viewership was through the toilet. But between the craziness of Trump and the sad craziness of COVID, it was great for media organizations. And so if it bled, it led, and they were just constantly cherry picking the worst stats. And I can't help but feel this overarching kind of sadness that more people didn't look at things objectively, which I know is very hard to do when people are dying. I'm not saying it's a tragedy that there weren't old or unhealthy people that got COVID and died. That is tragic, right? Pulling a bunch of deaths that should have happened in 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, 2027, pulling those deaths of the elderly and the sick into 2020, 2021, 2022, because the old and the unhealthy are the ones that were most susceptible to like negative outcomes. That is sad. Like losing a couple years off your life, that is absolutely a tragedy. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, like, looking at some of the stuff, I felt like my libertarian friends were a little bit more at peace because they were looking at the overall data. They were looking at the overall picture. And I mentioned when we started this book, what it means to be a libertarian really like changed my life a little bit and solidified a lot of the things that I thought. And on page 53 here of Charles Murray's book, there's this graph, and this graph looks something like this, right? Or something like this. And these are deaths per million miles driven, deaths per 100 million miles driven in motor vehicles. And if you see this chart in the book that I'm referencing, which we'll get a picture of this, Chris, we'll get a picture of this on page 53. The chart starts in 1925, right? And we used to have somewhere around 18 or 19 deaths per 100 million miles driven. And then, as you can see on this chart, it drops precipitously. And if you look at fatality rate per 100 million on this government chart that starts in 1966, you see the same thing. You say the same thing. This chart is actually great. This is number of vehicle miles traveled, right? Versus deaths per million miles driven. And if you notice, there is a amazingly sharp decrease until the late 60s to mid 70s. And then it does continue to taper off as cars get a little bit more safe. We get into smart technology, seatbelt gets better, whatnot. But if you see the big jump, or drop, I should say, the big drop in deaths per 100 million miles driven happens between about 1925 and 1955, right? And that's because it was, one, a new technology, so there was a lot of improvements to be made. Two, there was a lot of demand from consumers that said, hey, I don't want to drive this thing if it's a death trap, right? So consumer demand, horrific high-profile deaths, it forced Ford to build a safer car, to come up with safety mechanisms. However, if you look at a chart for somebody that's trying to tell a different story, you will see the seatbelt law came into effect in 1974. And around 1974, we had average deaths per 100 miles driven right around 4.5. So about 4.5 deaths per 100 miles driven when the seatbelt law went into effect in 1974. And now, today, modern times, deaths per 100 million miles driven is right over 1, somewhere between 1 and 2, depending on what study you follow. So if you just got this little piece of the graph, right, from 1975 until 2023, you could look at this, or somebody trying to sell you a story could show you this and say, see, we enacted the seatbelt law and deaths per 100 miles driven went down by 50%. Isn't that amazing that we created this regulation of seatbelt laws that require people to wear a seatbelt, and deaths went from about 4 per 100 million miles driven to 2. And if you just looked at that graph in isolation, you'd be like, wow, that's really great. I'm so happy the government came up with this law. I'm so happy that the government forced people to start wearing their seatbelts. Except for looking at the graph back to 1925, that doesn't really tell the story, right? Because between 1975 and 2023, so we've got almost 50 years of history there, deaths dropped from about 4 per 100 million miles to 2 or 1 per 100,000 miles, about a 50 to 60% drop, right? Like it's actually like 4 point something to 1.8 or whatever. The exact numbers don't matter, but you get the point. And that's great. And some of that has to do with technology, and some of that probably does have to do with the seatbelt law. But the reality was, by 1974, people were already wearing their seatbelt, right? If you look at deaths per 100 million miles driven in 1925 to 1970, that same kind of 50-year window, they dropped from like 18 deaths per 100 million to 4.5 per 100 million, right? So we had a greater 75 to 80% decrease just based on the fact that cars got safer, consumers were already wearing their seatbelt, consumers demanded safer cars. And when you look at this in totality, you're like, oh, the seatbelt law really didn't do shit. This was just the natural trend line that we were on for consumers to demand more safety, consumers being safer, aka voluntarily wearing their seatbelt, and cars just getting safer and drivers getting better, right? So it's just crazy to me that if you don't have an informal education, because I don't have a formal education on being a libertarian, but if you don't have an informal education on looking at these kind of things in the context of why government regulation rarely works and frequently it creates the opposite of the intended effect, if you haven't read a book like What It Means to Be a Libertarian, or you haven't looked at some of these graphs, or you haven't zoomed out or zoomed in from what the news or the government or the person who's trying to sell you something wants to show you, it's hard to look at this stuff in context. But I would say, please, please, please read a book like What It Means to Be a Libertarian, right? Look at the contrarian view of whatever you believe. If you think COVID was BS and the mask mandate was BS and you think vaccines are BS, I would encourage you to look at the other side of the equation, right? I have a very right-leaning friend who also happens to be a doctor who sends me articles probably once every other week on the efficacy of the vaccine and how it did save lives of a big cohort of older, unhealthy people. And that's important, right? I like looking at that contrarian data, right? If you're somebody who was like, all in, everybody must be triple boosted and wear a mask even till today, I would encourage you to look at some contrarian information, right? Look at some graphs that maybe disagree with your point. Maybe listen to a podcast from somebody much smarter than me, a virologist, or maybe somebody that's been on Joe Rogan or somebody that's been on Barry Weiss's podcast, and just listen to the opposing point of view, right? Because until you have some informal or formal training to like zoom out and look at this whole chart that we're looking at now, you would think that in 1974, when the seatbelt law got enacted, that like saved all the drivers who were dying, and that's just not the case. We actually saved more as a percentage of miles driven in comparison to the deaths. Sorry, I didn't word that correctly. And in comparison of deaths per 100 million miles driven, we actually saved more people just by letting the market do its thing from 1925 to 1974 than we did from 1974 to current. Right? So who knows? I'm sure seatbelts have saved lots of lives. I had a friend who just the other day bounced his head off the inside of a windshield and almost killed himself because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. So I'm sure seatbelts have saved tons of lives, and the market was kind of already doing that for us before the government.